Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Getting Started with Blazor. We are very excited to have Microsoft's Blazor PM, Dan Roth, with us, and also our own web program manager, Mehul Harry. In this session, Dan and Mehul will show you how to get started with Blazor. Dan will explain the fundamentals, discuss client versus server, introduce the roadmap, and create a simple Blazor app. Mehul will then demonstrate the new Developer Express Blazor controls and go into the roadmap for our future Blazor development. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today, and we will also send the link to the recording in a follow-up email. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. There is one caveat on this Q&A. Obviously, our team will be able to answer any questions you have about DevExpress, but if you have a specific question about Microsoft and Blazor, please add "for Dan" at the top of your question. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Dan Roth and Mehul Harry.
Thank you, Amanda. And my gosh, how lucky are we? We've got Daniel Roth from Microsoft who works on Blazor daily. Dan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here, Mehul.
Why, thank you. Thank you very much. So in today's agenda, we've got a lot to show. And so we're going to start off where Dan is going to give us a overview of Blazor, what it is, how to get started with it. And then I'll come in and I'll talk about our DevExpress offerings, what we've been working on, what you can expect and so forth. And then we're going to get into the roadmap, what's coming up for Blazor. Dan's going to talk about what they have in the works, what their plans are. And then I'll talk a little bit about DevExpress plans for Blazor as well. And finally, we'll do a Q&A. So if you have any questions about what is the future for .NET Core and anything, Dan has been with Microsoft a long time. He knows everything, right, Dan? And
just a few years. I can't say I know everything, but I'll do my best.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, since we've got a lot to show, Dan, I'll just hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, everyone, and to have a chance to share with you Blazor. I'm a program manager at Microsoft. I work on the ASP.NET team, and Blazor has been one of my passions for the past year and a half or so. What is Blazor? Well, Blazor is a new client-side web UI framework that allows you to build your client-side web logic with .NET instead of JavaScript. You can write with Blazor reusable web UI components. You write them in C# and using Razor syntax, which is a combination of HTML and C#. And the wonderful thing about this is it means you have full stack web development with .NET. You can share .NET code on the server and on the client. If you have validation logic or model types, you can share exactly the same assemblies and types on both sides of the wire. If you need to call into JavaScript, you can still do that. There's interop mechanisms in Blazor where you can call into JavaScript code from .NET code, and the opposite as well, call back into .NET from JavaScript. Now, how is this all possible? Well, it's made possible in large part due to a relatively new open web standard called WebAssembly. WebAssembly is a low-level bytecode for the web. It's supported and implemented by all the modern browsers on desktop and mobile. And the idea is that if you have code, regardless of what language it was written in, as long as you can compile that code to WebAssembly, it can now run in any browser on any platform at near native speeds. So this is great. It really opens the door for web development to use a much broader ecosystem of languages, frameworks, and tools for you to build your web applications. And of course, us on the .NET team, we would love .NET to work great on WebAssembly. And so that's what Blazor is based on. And if you look at how a Blazor app works, in the browser, at the bottommost layer, you have the browser's native WebAssembly support. On top of that, we built a .NET runtime in WebAssembly. And this is just a normal .NET runtime like you would use on a Windows machine or on Mac or Linux, like with .NET Core or .NET Framework. Just in this case, it happens to be built using WebAssembly, so it can run in the browser. On top of that runtime, we then built a web UI framework based on components, or Razor components. Use Razor syntax to author these components, and they interact with the DOM. So what happens is the DOM will send UI events to your components, which are all written in .NET and C#. Your components render, and then when they have figured out what DOM elements they want to be updated, Blazor will then apply those updates to the DOM, just the things that need to be changed. So that makes it nice and efficient. And all this runs client-side in the browser. There's no plugins required here. We're not taking your C# code and trying to transpile it into JavaScript. This is just normal .NET IL, .NET assemblies running in the browser on a .NET runtime.
So
That happens to be implemented using just open web standards.
well, hang on there, Dan. So let me ask this, and I'm sure you've gotten this common question a lot. This sounds a little bit like Silverlight.
Oh, yes. It does have some similarities. Some things that are similar. So Silverlight was also a way to run some .NET code in the browser. Now, granted, there are some really significant differences, though, that really make Blazor a completely different story. So first of all, Silverlight was based on a plugin. You couldn't run Silverlight apps in the browser without a custom plugin. Similar to like a Flash application, which of course really limited then the applicability of Silverlight in modern applications where you want to target devices like mobile devices. Also, so because Silverlight was based on a plugin, it was kind of a proprietary technology, whereas Blazor is based purely on open web standards. The only thing you need to run a Blazor app is the browser itself. You just need a browser that supports WebAssembly, and you're good to go. Also, Blazor is an open source and community-based project. So all of the Blazor code from top to bottom is available for you on GitHub. If you want to build the whole stack, including even the WebAssembly-based .NET runtime, you can do that. If you want to submit contributions or fork it or change it, you can do that. And this gives you, really great long-term confidence. Like if for say, Microsoft decided that it was no longer interested in investing as much into Blazor, well, the code is still out there and the community can then take it forward. So you have that additional long-term confidence. I don't foresee that happening. We're pretty excited about Blazor, but we want to make sure that customers feel that confidence that this is something that they can bet on for the long term.
Excellent. All right. I'm confident.
Would you like to see it? Shall we take a look?
Please.
Let's take a look at this Blazor thing. Okay, so to get started with Blazor, the first thing you're going to want to do is go to blazor.net. That's the one URL you need to remember. That will bring you to the Blazor homepage. Click on the Get Started button. That will take you to our docs, and you can find all the information about what you need to install to get going with the Blazor, to build a Blazor app. And it's really quick and fast. You can get going with Blazor in like 5-10 minutes. It does require the latest preview of .NET Core. You'll need to get .NET Core 3.0, the latest preview. You can then install the Blazor templates from the command line if you like command line development. If you're a Visual Studio person, you're going to want to get the latest Visual Studio preview. So get the preview channel. If you have Visual Studio 2019 but you're not on the preview channel, that's not actually enough to do Blazor development. You are going to want to get the latest preview VS so that the Blazor tooling then works. And then we have a Visual Studio extension for Blazor that you can install on top of that. That will just bring in the Blazor templates. If you prefer to use Visual Studio Code, that's totally cool. You can install Visual Studio Code and the C# extension, which comes with both Razor and Blazor support, and then you're ready to go. Or if you prefer to use some other editor of your own choosing, that's fine. There's a complete CLI command line experience for creating, building, and running your Blazor apps. Now, I've already done all these things, so let me go back to Visual Studio. As you can see in the upper right, I've got the preview channel installed, so it looks like we're good to go there. I'm going to create a new project. Now, Blazor is part of the ASP.NET Core umbrella, so I'm going to select here that I want to create an ASP.NET Core web application. And then click Next, and let's call this my Blazor App 1, and we'll create that. All right, so this will then bring up the, create a new ASP.NET Core web application dialog. You can see all the ASP.NET Core templates here. I want to create a Blazor app, so let's look at the Blazor templates. There are a few of them. We'll talk a little bit about what the differences are between these, but the one I'm going to pick to start out with is this ASP.NET Core hosted Blazor app. And the reason why I'm picking that one is because this template is set up to give me full stack development. It'll give me .NET on the server with .NET Core. It'll give me .NET in the browser with Blazor, and then I can even have .NET standard class libraries that I share between the server and the client. So I actually get, as you can see here, 3 projects in this solution. I get a client project, a server project, and then this shared project, which is just a .NET standard class library. So the client project, that's my Blazor app. That's the part that's going to run in the browser. The server project, that's the .NET Core part. That's going to run on the server. And then share just has some classes that we can share between those 2 projects. So for example, I've got this little weather forecast type. It's just a simple type that's shared by both the other projects. If we go looking in the dependencies, we can see the client references .shared, and also the server references .shared. So you can share code. You don't have to rewrite your code twice in 2 different languages and in 2 different platforms. Super cool. All right, let's go ahead and run this.
So
and see what we got.
This setup is a lot like what I might have. For example, instead of a client app, I could have an Angular. So it's similar to some of those templates where you set up some of those client-side projects, but with a server-side backend.
Yes, it is very similar. Like Blazor is very much a single-page application framework, just like Angular, just like React. And in fact, Blazor itself, like the output of this client project, is just going to be a bunch of static files. You don't actually need .NET on the server in order to run the Blazor part of this app. If you wanted to deploy those files to, like, GitHub pages or Azure Static Site Hosting, you can do that because it's just a bunch of files that will get downloaded to the browser, just like an Angular or React app would be. The nice thing though about having .NET on the server is that we can do these things like share code and have model types that are shared on both sides of the wire. All right, so here's the running app, and as you can see, we have a few tabs. I can click around a little bit, and then if I go back up to the browser nav tools, I can go back and forward. So that's client-side routing in Blazor. If we look at this home tab, we just have some simple static content, nothing too surprising there. But on this counter page, if I click the button, the count goes up, and there's no page refresh happening here. This isn't being rendered on the server. This is all being rendered on the client. Normally, you would have to do this with JavaScript, where you click the button and then use some JavaScript to update the DOM, to update the UI, but I didn't have to write any JavaScript in order to make this happen. This was all .NET and C#. Now on this third tab, we have a fetch data page. This is actually issuing an HTTP request to the server, calling a web API that's in the server project. Let me show you that real quick. So if we go look in the server project, under this controllers folder, you'll see there's this sample data controller, which is just a normal ASP.NET Core web API that returns some basic random weather forecast data. So we're issuing an HTTP request to this controller, pulling down some JSON data, and then in the Blazor app, in the browser, it deserializes that data into .NET objects and uses Razor syntax, Razor logic in order to render this table.
Well,
all right, so what does this code look like? Oh, you like that? Good.
I do love that because like you said, I didn't write JavaScript, right? So let me ask you this. Are you saying I'm going to completely avoid JavaScript altogether with Blazor?
Well, you can. Like, you can just write your C# code. Now, there are cases where you may still want to call into JavaScript. For example, maybe you do have some JavaScript libraries that you want to continue to leverage. Right. That's totally fine. You can use a JavaScript interop mechanism that's available in Blazor where you can call directly from your .NET code into JavaScript. Similar thing for like browser APIs, like if you want to call into local storage or into the geolocation API or whatever functionality the browser exposes, you can do all that by interoping with JavaScript. So there may be some cases where you decide, like, for this app, I actually want to do some JavaScript interop. I want to go to that layer. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, we expect you won't have to do that. For browser APIs, we actually don't ship .NET wrappers for the majority of the browser APIs today. There is an effort from the runtime team to actually generate a bunch of those, so we may actually end up doing that. But we do provide the abstraction, and so what people in the community have started doing is they've started building NuGet packages that handle the JavaScript interop for you, so you get to call into those browser APIs or common JavaScript libraries pretty much as if they were written in C#. So for the 90% case, I'm guessing you won't actually have to write a lot of JavaScript. Maybe early on in the Blazor lifetime, when there's not as many of those packages available yet, you may have to roll your own. But we expect that going forward, most of the APIs that you'll want to call, there'll be a package you can just install and use, and then maybe for that like 5% case that you really need to interop with something that no one's already done for you, you can do that yourself.
Nice. Okay. And
now oh, sorry, do you have another question?
Just a quick question. So in essence, I mean, I can continue to write Razor and so forth, but the interrupt gives you that option that says, listen, if you've built up some logic already with JavaScript, you can use that interrupt. So it just makes it easy. I don't have to completely try to rewrite everything that I have in JavaScript for Blazor.
Absolutely, that's correct.
Awesome.
Okay, let's look at what the code actually looks like for these components. So each of these .razor files in my Blazor app, those are a component. Those are a reusable piece of UI. Here's the counter component. It has an at page directive at the top. That says that this component is routable. Any requests sent to /counter, they should be routed to this component so that it can then render. Then we have some normal static HTML content. But when we go to render the current count, we switch over to Razor using this @ symbol, and we're rendering the value of this C# field. Everything in this functions block is going to be basically put inside of a class, a C# class that will be generated from this Razor file. So this field then gets rendered right here, and then we have a button, and every time the button is clicked, we invoke this onClick handler. This is just the normal HTML onClick attribute, but instead of putting JavaScript in here, we're again switching over to C# with the @ symbol, and we're calling our increment count C# method, which increments the field. The field then updates, and then the component re-renders itself, which results in the current count being displayed. So that's how this is all working right here. Now, to show you that this really is happening in the browser, we do actually have a debugging mechanism where you can debug your .NET code directly in the browser using the normal browser dev tools. Now, if I F12 here, and let's look at the console for the browser, you can see there's this little message here saying debugging hotkey, hit Shift-Alt-D. So that's the special gesture that you do in a Blazor app when you want to debug your code client side. So I'm going to do that, Shift-Alt-D. Now, in order to make this work, you actually need the browser to be running in remote debugging mode, because the way we're going to get debugging to work is we're going to go through a debugging proxy that we build for you that the dev tools connect to, which then connects to the tab that you're trying to debug. And it augments the normal browser debugging protocol with .NET specific concepts. So this is telling me that I'm not currently running in remote debugging mode. I need to do that. So let's shut down the browser and we'll rerun it. MS Edge, and then let's put in the command that it told me to do. And this time, now it'll be in remote debugging mode, and this should now work. So let's see if we can get that to work. So once it comes up, let's hit the debugging hotkey again. Let's give it a second to load. There it goes. And boop. Okay, so Shift-Alt-D. Now this should pop up the browser dev tools. And there they are. Okay, great. So let's put these side by side with the browser that we're trying to debug. Awesome. And then let's go look at the sources tab. And let's see. Yeah. Okay, cool. So as you can see here, we are seeing our .NET DLLs in the browser. And if we expand one of these, like our client DLL that was built from the client project, I can see all my Razor files. I can see my C# files. And we can even do things like set breakpoints. Like I'm going to set a breakpoint in my increment count method. Let's go to counter. I'm going to click the button, and boom, there, we just hit a breakpoint in C# code running on a WebAssembly-based .NET runtime, all running in the browser.
That is fantastic, Dan. And Dan, I got to say, you finally made one of my dreams come true. I've been asking, how can I get DLLs in the browser? And
some people get a little nervous about this, actually.
I
they
do.
See DLLs in the
what
browser.
About security, Dan? Do I have to worry?
No, so the wonderful thing about the way WebAssembly works is that WebAssembly runs in the same security sandbox that JavaScript runs in. So the DLLs that you're seeing downloaded, they're not like running directly on your Windows machine, on your OS. Those DLLs are being executed by a WebAssembly-based runtime, which means they can't do anything that the browser security sandbox wouldn't allow you to do. You can't do anything more than you could do with just JavaScript. So you can't go access the file system in arbitrary ways. You can't go touch the registry. It's all running in that same browser security sandbox.
Excellent.
So here's what I just hit a button and mean to hit. Let me refresh again. So here's what the network traffic looks for this application. We can see what's being downloaded. go. And I think I am filtering on something that I didn't mean to filter on. Is that right? Oh, where is the? Yeah, I accidentally hit this H up top. There we go. So if we look at what's downloaded, let's see. We see the HTML, some CSS, a little bit of infrastructure JavaScript that we provide to get the WebAssembly runtime up and going. And then here's the actual runtime. So this mono.wasm file, WASM is short for WebAssembly, is what's actually executing all of these .NET DLLs that you then see below. So there's my client DLL and then all of its dependencies. Now, you may wonder, like, why are we using Mono? So Mono is actually the Microsoft-supported .NET runtime for client-side cross-platform development. Like if you're building a Xamarin app for iOS or Android, you're using Mono. So, well, Blazor is a client-side application model, so Mono is actually a great fit, and we've really enjoyed using them for Blazor. Now, all these DLLs, we actually run them all through a .NET IL linker to strip out any unused IL from those DLLs to try and make them as small as possible. So what does this app weigh in at? So if you look at the bottom, you can see there at the bottom it says it's 2.4 megabytes transferred. Okay, so you might have one of two reactions to that. One reaction might be like, wow, like I can't believe you fit like a whole .NET runtime and an app in just 2.4 megabytes. And that's true, we did. You might also have the reaction like, oh, but isn't 2.4 megabytes a little still heavy for a web application? And we would agree with you with that as well. We'd like to make this number smaller. Things that we're doing is we have a bunch of additional trimming that we can do on the assemblies themselves on the WebAssembly runtime. We're actually only running the linker right now over the framework libraries. There's a bunch of other libraries that we haven't actually included in that linker pass that we can include. We can do more clever things with better compression algorithms, like using Brotli. Also, all the normal HTTP caching stuff applies to Blazor apps. All these files, if you want to put them on a CDN and use HTTP caching so they're only downloaded once, that all works. But still, we'd like to make the size smaller. We think we can get easily under 2 megabytes, and we're going to try and get it as close to 1 megabyte as we can.
So Dan, let me ask you, is this one of the major challenges looking forward at Blazor?
Yeah, the Blazor actually originally started out as an experimental project. We kicked it off about a year and a half ago, like beginning of 2018. And one of the reasons why it started out as experimental is, well, we weren't sure. First of all, technically, can we do this? Like, can we get a runtime to be small and work in the browser? We also weren't sure if people would want to use it. Like, do people really want to write .NET code that runs in the browser? The overwhelming response on the latter question is yes. Like, well, .NET developers tell us that they are really excited about being able to reuse their .NET skills, the APIs they know, the tools they know, the language they know for client-side web development. And we think all the technical challenges we have either already resolved or have solutions for. Now one of them we're still working on is making the runtime as small as we can. So that's one area of investment that we're still doing. There's also a couple others, like making that debugging experience really smooth. We'd like to enable that debugging experience in Visual Studio, where Visual Studio can connect to the browser and debug remotely using the same browser debugging protocol, and have it be higher fidelity. And then lastly, also just improving performance, like making the runtime perf of the app really good. Currently, that mono.wasm file is actually an interpreter-based runtime. It interprets the .NET IL, which is not great for like computationally intensive workloads. Like you're not going to want to write a Bitcoin miner that runs in the browser. That would be very, very slow. We are also working on what we call AOT compilation, where we can compile more of your app instead of to just DLLs, to actually compile your app all the way down to WebAssembly, and that does recover a lot of the performance. Has some trade-offs with size, so we're fiddling around with the knobs right now to see what the right balance is there. But those are the three main areas of long-term investment right now to make the .NET on WebAssembly story really good.
All right, yeah, the Visual Studio integration will be fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the performance enhancements. But hang on, I got to make a note here. I got to cancel my upcoming Blazor Bitcoin project.
Bitcoin miner project.
You're
All
just
right,
killing my
let me show
dreams,
you a little
man.
bit about components and Blazor. So remember I said each of these Razor files is a reusable component. And the way you reuse a component is using HTML-like syntax. So for example, if I wanted to, on the home page here, put a counter right on the home page, I can just start typing an element that with the name counter, and you can see it shows up in IntelliSense. Let me go ahead and complete that. So now I should have, in addition to my counter that's on its home page, I should have one on the home as well. I think I have to rerun. Sorry about that. Let me re-execute. So we rebuild the client-side assets and get that up and running again. And now instead of just a counter on its own tab, we should see a counter on the home page as well with its own independent count. Build started. Give that a second to just go ahead and complete.
And by the way, again, like I said, I'm a fan of JavaScript as well, and especially with all the stuff that TypeScript is doing with it is fantastic. But it's great to see that I can write client-side apps with C# and Razor syntax. Again, that's just an investment that so many of us have made over the years that we can still leverage our knowledge base in C#.
Yeah, that's the beauty. I feel like with Blazor, often that I can now just be productive. I can now just focus on my app instead of having to remember or looking into which JavaScript framework is the current hotness and how to set up my Webpack configuration. Okay, so there's my counter now. It's on the home page in addition to the counter on the separate tab. Now, components can also have parameters, like you can pass state into components. That's a stateful model. So let's go back to our counter. Let's have a way to set the how much it increments by. So let's say increment amount, and let's default this to 1, and then we'll change the amount we increment by to this custom parameter. And to make this a parameter, I just add the parameter attribute. So now this is a component parameter. And parameters aren't usually public because they're kind of like parameters in a constructor. They're the things you pass in. You don't fiddle with them after you've created the component. And now if I go to my back to the home page and I start typing here increment amount, you can see I get IntelliSense. The way you set parameters is using attributes. So let's go ahead and complete that. Let's make the home page counter increment by tens now, whereas the counter that's on its home page will increment by 1. And so the nice thing about components, like these are just classes. Like you can create class libraries full of components, and then you can package them up as NuGet packages and share them on a NuGet gallery, and people can just download, install them, and use your components just like you would, a class library. So it makes this really nice reusability and sharing ecosystem of reusable UI. So there, yeah. So now we're incrementing by tens on the home page, whereas the counter on its own page is only incrementing by ones.
A quick note
so
about those components. So it seems very similar to kind of like what Angular does, where everything in the UI is built up of a component. Is that?
Oh yeah, it's. I mean, we took a lot of inspiration from the existing front-end JavaScript frameworks like Angular and React and Vue and so forth, and a lot of the concepts that you see in Blazor, if you're familiar with those frameworks, will feel very familiar. But also with with a .NET flair. With our we took our own opportunity to try and make it better and make the tooling really good, make the experience super productive.
Excellent.
Now I was really happy that last month we got to announce that Blazor for WebAssembly is no longer experimental. This is not an experimental technology anymore. It is now an official preview. That means that it is on a track to ship. We are planning to ship the WebAssembly support for .NET. Which is really great. This means that this will be something that in the future you can use in your production applications. Exactly when it will ship is still being worked on, but we'll talk more about the roadmap in just a minute. Despite the fact, though, that it's been experimental and now it's moved from experimental to preview, but still it's not something that you'd want to use in production just yet. Of course, we don't always follow our own guidance. At Microsoft, we're already actually using Blazor in production through this try.net technology. Try.net is a way where you can write some C# code in the browser directly and just run it without having to install any .NET bits. It's a way to just get a feel for what coding in .NET is like. Originally, this site was built using the code was compiled and then run on the server, which meant having a whole bunch of container instances that they had to manage to keep all that arbitrary C# code isolated and not be a security risk. That was incredibly expensive to run, but the management, they found out about the bill, and they said, well, is there anything that we could do to make this cheaper? And the team said, well, we could run it client side, but we'd need to use Blazor for that. And they were like, let's do that. And so they did. And so this, all of the tutorials that you see in the C# docs, those are all actually running with Blazor today, client side. Now, there's an additional hosting model that we have also been working on for Blazor apps. We've been talking right now about primarily about the client-side programming model, where everything runs in the browser. But there's another hosting model that we've been working on that we call server-side Blazor. In server-side Blazor, your components actually run on the server. But they're the same components that you would run on the client, and they still enable you to have that rich interactivity as if you're writing true client-side logic. How does that work? Well, we run the components on the server, and then we download a little bit of JavaScript into the browser that sets up a real-time SignalR connection with the server. The browser then sends UI events to the server. The components execute. They do their rendering. Blazor figures out exactly what parts of the DOM need to be updated. It serializes that information back down to the browser and then applies it to the DOM. So the components run on the server on a normal .NET Core runtime, but you still get to have that component-based, rich, interactive experience. Now, there's a couple nice things about this model. One is the download size of the app is super small because you're not having to download a whole WebAssembly runtime with your app, so the app starts up much faster. The architecture of your app can actually be quite a bit simpler because the components are running on the server on a full .NET runtime, so they can do things like talk directly to the database or any server resources that they need to interact with. You don't have to do HTTP requests to some web APIs that you have to build in order to get access to server resources because you're already there. Some things that are, however, that are downsides to the server-side model is that, well, you now have a different scale-out story. You're paying with your server resources to run the client UI. You need to be able to maintain a connection for each client that's using your application, and you need to be able to maintain the state for the UI that they're using while they're using that application. Whereas with the client side, you can just push all that stuff down to the browser. So, it's trade-offs, but for us, implementing server-side Blazor is actually a little bit easier because it doesn't have the WebAssembly dependency, which still has some work to be done. So server-side Blazor is actually shipping in .NET Core 3.0, which is already in preview and will ship later this year. Client-side Blazor is evolving in parallel. Every time we ship a .NET Core 3.0 preview release, we ship an update to client-side Blazor that uses exactly the same component model, and it will then ship at some future point after .NET Core 3.0 ships once the WebAssembly runtime is ready. So now let me show you. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Are you recommending then for now, if folks start off with Blazor, that they look at the server-side approach?
Yeah, well, server side is going to ship first. It'll be available in production first. So if you're really interested to write a Blazor app that you want to actually have running in production, then server side Blazor is the thing you're going to want to look at. Now, the nice thing though is that the components are the same. If later when we ship the WebAssembly support, you decide, no, I actually want to run this client side, you can then flip those components to just move to the other side of the wire, and essentially it's the same app, but now running directly in the browser. You have to do some work to make sure you're using abstractions for stuff that's server specific, so that when you flip to the client, you're not trying to talk to the database directly from the client. That won't work because you're in the browser. But as long as you have service abstractions that abstract that stuff away, you should be able to flip it to the client later after you've done the server-side work, no problem. That's a great sort of stepping stone. All right, let me show you a server-side Blazor app real fast. So I'm going to, again, create an ASP.NET Core web application. Let's call this my server-side Blazor app 1. Let's create that. All right. And then instead of picking the template that we picked before, we're going to pick Blazor server-side. Now this will look very similar to what we saw before. It's only a single project because everything's running on the server. We don't need a separate project for the client assembly. But if we look at the code, like we have the same code that we saw earlier. We have the fetch data component and the counter component. Now the counter code is literally character for character the same as what we saw for the counter component in the client-side Blazor application. If we run the server-side Blazor app, it will feel exactly the same as well. Let's wait for it to come up, but you're going to see the 3 tabs. You can click on the counter and things increment. Oh, and I did Control F5 again, but that's all right. Well, that'll be fine. Let's get this up and running. So one of the really great things about server-side Blazor is you're now running on full .NET Core. So if you want to like do debugging in VS, well, that's just the normal .NET Core debugging experience, and I'll show that in just a second. Was there a question? Think I heard.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So, are there any customers now using the client-side approach already?
So the try.net site that I mentioned earlier, that is client-side Blazor.
I see.
That's what that's based on. There are a lot of people that are experimenting with client-side Blazor and exploring it, but because it's still in preview, most people I should say are only using it in a like exploratory fashion. But there are a lot of folks that are pretty eager for it to ship so that they can then use it. And in the meantime, the server-side Blazor will be available sooner. So here we can click the counter, it goes up. The fetch data page looks exactly the same. You'll notice that if I refresh this app, let's just like F5 a couple of times. It starts up pretty fast. Like I don't know if you remember from the client-side Blazor app, it would have a little loading text while it was downloading the runtime. Here we don't have to do that. It's all just pretty near instantaneous that the app loads. And that's because if we look what's being downloaded for this application, let's refresh so we can see all the files. Much smaller. Like we're only getting about 400 kilobytes of downloaded payload. There's no WebAssembly runtime being downloaded here, but we are setting up this WebSocket connection. And so let's clear the frames for the WebSocket connection. Let's go to the counter. Let me clear it again. Now, every time I click the button, you can see some binary messages have flown to the server. The components run server side. The UI gets updated and sent back down to the browser and applied. And you can see these payloads for these little messages are really small. They're on the order of bytes. To show that really is happening, let's rerun the app one more time, but this time in the debugger, and see if we can hit a breakpoint in our server-side Blazor code. So we'll just get the app running again. Let's go ahead and close this. And then in the counter, let's set a breakpoint right here. Same spot we did before, but now in Visual Studio. Let the app pop up after the ICE Express wakes up. And
drum roll.
All right, great. So now we go to our counter. Okay, and click. And we should be hitting a breakpoint. So, no, I don't think it registered my click button. There it goes. There, we hit a breakpoint in Visual Studio. So that's all running now server-side. So that's server-side Blazor. That's shipping sooner, and essentially the same component model, but something that you can start playing around with today. So that's your like quick getting started with Blazor tutorial. Yeah, hope you guys will take a chance to try it out today because it's super easy to get started with.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. So let me jump in and take over here, and you should be able to see. So as Dan just showed you the Blazor overview, let me now cover quickly the DevExpress offerings. And thank you very much, Dan. So if you take a look, and you may have already seen all the blog posts and newsletters we've been sending out, but if you go to devexpress.com/Blazor, this is your essential landing page, main starting point for everything that DevExpress is working on for Blazor. Now, currently, we are making a set of UI components. We decided to make them native for Blazor, which means there was even some questions like, hey, a lot of times, you guys take existing set of component libraries and wrap them for something else. We decided not to do that here. We thought about it, but it didn't make sense, right? For example, we have a whole 65 plus set of components for the client side. They're written in JavaScript, and we actually wrap them for Angular and Vue and React and all that stuff. Why did we do that here? Well, it doesn't make sense for Blazor because Blazor's key strength here is .NET and C#. So we actually had our ASP.NET team to work on this. So we splintered off a set of devs who were super excited about Blazor, and they are focused exactly on creating native set of components for Blazor. So that is all being written from scratch. Now you might say, well, Dan showed some really interesting stuff where he was writing Razor and updating parameters. How do I learn more about Blazor? Well, that is one of the things that we have created for you to learn about Blazor. And that is, if you scroll down, you'll see this online training link here. Now, when you click on it, what you'll find is a set of videos. Now, Dan, have you seen these videos?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, these are great. In fact, we we link to them from our Blazor homepage. So for people that are interested in learning about Blazor, it's a really nice, comprehensive set of content about using Blazor.
Thank you. Yeah, and so our in-house training expert developed these, and it's a whole course, something that you might find, let's say, on a site like Pluralsight or something like that, but we've made it completely free, and which is one of the reasons Microsoft was really happy to see. And these are focused only on Blazor. Now, we do plan to keep these updated as Dan and his team keep updating Blazor with new previews and new features and so forth. But what you can do is you can learn about the core things about Blazor. The component structure, how does dependency injection and data access work, some things about routing. We mentioned JavaScript interop earlier. So definitely take a look at these videos to learn about Blazor. So I would recommend that if you're curious, how does Blazor work, to really get to know the internals of it and so forth. That is a great set of videos. And it's much more than we can cover in this hour-long webinar today. Maybe in the future, we'll do a whole different webinar. You know what we should do, Dan? We should start a Twitch channel where we just sit here and install Visual Studio like 2019 preview, and that could be riveting.
And just do, and then just like write Blazor code like all the time.
You know what? We could absolutely do that. We could absolutely do that. If you have like 3 or 4 hours free on a day, let me know, and we will we'll get right on that. Okay, so but jokes aside, I would recommend this page because we also have the intro blog post here where we talk about what we made, why we made it, all that kind of interesting stuff. But my recommendation for you is you want to get your hands on this controls. You want to say, I want to get in Visual. I've got Visual Studio 2019 preview. I've got all the latest bits and so forth. Well, how do you get started with DevExpress? Well, the online demos are a good example to show you what we offer. And what we offer are 9 UI components at the moment. And this includes powerful grid component. And this is one of our most popular components that's used. And out of the box, it already supports things like templates, data editing, sorting, and so forth. But what's more interesting is we're also adding some really powerful features like support for validation. Now, Dan, I saw recently you guys added data validation. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have some basic components that we ship out of the box now for helping you write forms, and they are wired up so that they can do validation using like data annotations, or if you want to use your own validation system, then you can do that.
And it's such a great feature, right? This is one of the strengths of using, let's say, .NET and C# is you've got the ability to do, you know, EF, Entity Framework or something like that. But what's nice is with data annotations, you can just decorate your properties with some attributes and say, look, this field description is required, has a minimum maximum length, and if they screw that up, this is the error message I want you to display. And then the framework will help you enforce that. So for example, here, what we're doing with our grid is we're supporting that validation. And what's nice is we present it in a beautiful way. So for example, not only do we just pick up on it, but we help you enforce it and display these error messages as well as highlight the fields. And so this is one of the reasons that you're going to want to say, listen, that table that Dan showed, yeah, it's nice, but I want something more powerful. And you know, Dan is focused in on making the framework. We're focused in on making the UI powerful and functional and feature rich, and that's our specialty. So we've got support for.
Can I just say, Mehul, this is one of the things I'm most excited about with Blazor. That this ecosystem of reusable web UI components. I don't want to have to write a grid. I don't know how to handle tens of thousands of rows and deal with filtering and all those things. And I could just go and find an already built component and use it. That's industrial strength, ready to go. Like that just makes it so much easier for me to help get my app done.
And I think you nailed it, Dan, is that, as devs, we are focused in on a certain set of logic, right, that we have to work it. And that's where companies like us, we can really come in, help save you time. And what's nice is we are making this, again, I'm very proud to say we're making them native for Blazor. So they work, whatever feature Dan decides to add next week, we're going to likely support it because we want to make sure that this is something that is working for you, right? So if you see Dan talk about a feature and you can likely assume that's something that we either support or will be supporting in the future. All right, that said, besides the grid, we've got a pivot grid, we've got a bunch of editors, and we've got a form layout component that really saves you time, because all you do is you point it at your data model and we generate the forms for you. I mean, this like 90% of the web is creating forms, right, Dan? And this thing makes them forms for you, so it saves you a ton of time.
Nice. Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely. And so all of these are available. Now, how do you get started in Visual Studio? Well, also on this landing page, we've got this link here that says download free preview. When you click on it, at the moment, it's going to take you to our GitHub page. So at this moment, you might say like, wow, this is not like the typical DevExpress stuff. Where's the assembly and all that kind of stuff? I mean, where's the installer? Again, a lot of this stuff right now, in fact, our Blazor components are offered free of charge under the DevExpress preview license, meaning that they're also in preview. So while Blazor's in preview, and we'll talk about roadmap in just a second, but we're going to improve all of this stuff, right? Eventually, there'll be an installer, and the Visual Studio experience will get even better, and all that. We'll have like a file new template and all that kind of good stuff. For now, what we're doing is we're directing you to our page here, because a lot of this stuff, as Dan mentioned with the preview, it is early bits, right? You're downloading a preview of Visual Studio. You're downloading previews from Dan's team for Blazor and so forth. But again, you know, all that stuff is going to get better. It's going to get optimized and all that good stuff. So not only do we have a getting started, how to create a new project, but we've got some useful things about what you're going to need to know about checkboxes you need to enable in Visual Studio and all that good stuff. But to create it, really, it's all the same things Dan has already shown, which is how to create a new project. You use that ASP.NET Core template, and then we recommend, like Dan does, with the Blazor server side, but everything, as Dan mentioned earlier, everything with that we created for Blazor works both server side and client side, and I'll show that in just a second. Now, the way we're offering our set of components is through a NuGet package manager, and the way you get access to that is you're going to need to add this NuGet API, NuGet.DevExpress Early Access API URL to your Visual Studio. All right, so let's take a look at that, Dan. And if you haven't, what you can do is here I've got a simple project, and it's the exact same thing that Dan showed earlier. It's got the same pages and so forth. Now, what you want to do is, if you want to add DevExpress to an existing package now, first thing is go to your NuGet package manager settings. Make sure under the package sources you've got this DevExpress EA. I call it, you can call it whatever you want, but make sure you got the right URL, which is NuGet.DevExpress Early Access API. And then you can right click on whatever Blazor project you've got and manage the NuGet packages. And from here, if you change your package source to DevExpress EA and go to the Browse tab, you'll see the devexpress.blazor. Now, what you want to do is make sure you always get the latest version. Now, our pre-release CTPs are listed on our GitHub page, and what you want to do is click Install with the latest version. Select OK to say, listen, we're going to be adding some other things like other NuGet packages, and of course, accept our license. And once that's done, it will download the NuGet package right to your local solution. From there, you are nearly 90% of the way there, because at the moment we need to add a couple of things. Now, we mentioned this in the GitHub page as well, which is that on the GitHub page we mentioned that in the client runtime directory we have 2 files, and right now at the moment they needed to my screen. Okay, they need to be added manually, meaning that we have to go into Visual Studio and add them in. Now, Dan, is there any mechanism in Blazor that we can make this a little bit easier? So right now, I have to recommend developers add this DXBlazor CSS and DXBlazor JS file, which are used by our components. So they're necessary to be added to this www root folder.
Yeah, so you do need to add any static assets that the NuGet package brings. You will need to add links or script tags for those assets so that they can be brought into the project. And that's actually pretty important because, like for JavaScript files, you're going to want to be able to control the order. You maybe want to do things like run it through a client-side build chain to like bundle and those types of things. So that part will be the same. One thing that we have started talking about is creating a pattern where to help people bring in those links. Imagine the library also had like a tag helper that just in one line said add DevExpress component scripts or something like that.
Yeah.
That would be a strongly typed tooling enabled way of helping you add those script links. That's something we're talking about as well. But yes, you do need to add those links in order to bring the static assets into the project.
Awesome. So I'll be looking for that add DevExpress tag helper in the next release of Blazor. Thanks, Dan.
That's right. Just for you.
Awesome. But yeah, so when you add them, the assets in there, you want to also link them. So go into the host HTML file, and in the head section, of course, add the assets. Now, once you've done this, you can essentially then go into your main imports file and say, hey, I want to start using devexpress.blazor, and then of course start going into, for example, the different pages. You can go into, let's say, the counter page, replace or add a pager, DevExpress pager here, or if you want, you can do something like, hey, take this table, which is a very simple table. And use something like our grid that has filtering and sorting and editing and all that good stuff. Now, I'm not going to get into it today. It's a little bit longer because we have to update the data model and all that stuff. Instead, what I recommend and what I'm going to show you is download from GitHub our entire project here. So what I've done here today is basically hit clone or download, and I've downloaded the entire Blazor project here. So as you can see in the Blazor project, when you download it, you're going to get both the client in the demo, both the client side and server side, and they both are exactly the same NuGet package. So you know that our components work on both sides. And what's nice is it is the entire set of demos, these demos that are available. So let me just show you that real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit about the roadmap. Now, let's bring up the recent projects. Let's look at the server side.
So you get that whole site, like the whole demo page stuff with all those components in just one GitHub repo.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
We decided, you know what, let's just put the power in the people's hands because they'll have questions about how do I use the grid? How do I use the editors, right? And so we wanted to enable all those scenarios right in their local environment so they can test it against their local data.
Look at that. It's like the whole thing. That's awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so like you showed earlier, Dan, if we take a look at this and, for example, take a look at, what was it, the network WS, and let's refresh this. And then, as Dan said, there we got the frames.
Yes, this is a server-side Blazor version of the app, and you also have the client-side Blazor version as well. It looks like, look here, that would be the other project you had there. Cool, that's great.
Awesome. Yep. So while I load this up, let's do this. We'll talk a little bit about the upcoming items. So let me run this real quick so people know we're not messing around. This is really real, and we're really excited by Blazor. We're really excited by the potential, but not just the potential. The feedback we've seen. I don't know if I've seen this kind of excitement from devs. I think it's C# is such a popular language, right? And so when we see here, let's go to the sources tab here, and there we go. See, we got Wasm. So the exact same demo works both client side and server side. All right, with that, Dan, let's shift into the talking about the future. What's happening with Blazor for the future?
Oh yeah. So when is all this stuff going to ship? So server-side Blazor, like I said, is going to ship in .NET Core 3.0. It's already in preview. We've had several previews, in fact, already. We shipped Preview 5 back in May, and we're basically shipping an updated preview every month. So Preview 6 is going to ship later this month in June, and probably just a little under a week here, and it's got a whole bunch of great new stuff like authentication support for Blazor and better support for static assets. Lots of great cool things coming in Preview 6. And then Preview 7 and 8 will be in July and August. The July and August releases are actually go live releases, which means that we're telling customers you can go ahead and try this out in production. Like go, feel free to go live with it. It's kind of like those are release candidate releases. Now, does that mean there won't be any more changes? No, we are still evolving Blazor. Like there's things that we need to still do. So you should still expect that between Preview 7, Preview 8, and GA that there'll be some evolution there. So if you do decide to go live early with Blazor with one of those preview releases, make sure you account for that in your planning. But the final stable release of .NET Core 3.0 with server-side Blazor will be in September, later this year. Now, Blazor for WebAssembly will ship sometime later, as soon as the WebAssembly runtime is ready to go. How much later? We don't know yet, unfortunately. We've talked about trying to get it done by the end of this year. My gut is that's probably going to be too tight and that won't happen. I think early next year, like Q1 of 2020, is a good bet. But I wouldn't plan any product cycles based on that just yet. That's not a commitment. We're still having discussions about about the remaining work and when it can be completed. But sometime after .NET Core 3.0, not too much later, hopefully a few months, we will then ship the Blazor for WebAssembly support.
Excellent. All right. And here's all the links that Dan showed off today. And again, Dan is very accessible. We'll show his contact info in a minute. And stick around. We've got a couple of poll questions, but we're going to get to the Q&A. I promise we're going to get to the Q&A, and Dan is going to answer all your questions. Now,
do my best.
For all things DevExpress Blazor, definitely go to devexpress.com/Blazor. This is our main landing page where we're going to put all the assets, and you're going to see our set of components. So what do we got coming around the corner? We've got more things planned. I would really encourage folks to definitely check out our GitHub page, because on it we've got a great set of people reporting all sorts of things. In fact, we've got people reporting bugs to us and we're closing them. We got people putting components wish list. I would love to see any comments, questions. Hey, I want to see a dialogue. I want to see a WYSIWYG editor, all this good stuff. So we're having those conversations in the open, as they say. So it's definitely on GitHub. Let us know. Hey, if we messed up something or you want something more out of our support for Blazor, let us know what that is, and we'd be happy to hear from you. And okay, so beyond that, we are like you, waiting for Dan and his team to get to that eventual version of 1.0 release. Okay, now before we go, Amanda is going to run a poll, so please look for that and answer those questions. It's just two simple questions. Now, I don't know if you want me to read those questions at all, but basically it's about are you using Blazor now? Have you tried it yet? And there's also a second question that Dan is also interested in about which hosting model are you interested in, server-side, client-side. So please do that. And also, I would recommend on our Blazor landing page, if you look at this initial blog post, there is a little survey at the end. And if you have time, I'd love for you to give us your little feedback on that, because feedback is vital. Right, Dan?
Absolutely.
Okay, with that, Dan, let's take some Q&A, and there have been some really interesting questions. Now, the first one is, there was actually a question from a customer who asked that, there's been a lot of news lately and about the future of .NET Core and web forms and this and that. So going forward, is Blazor the web development framework of the future? I mean, like, should people stop even considering MVC? What's going on? What's the plan with Blazor?
Yeah, that's a great question. is Blazor sort of the thing that now everyone has to move to, as I think is often implicit in that question. So historically, ASP.NET has always had a really great support for doing what we often call server-side rendered apps, where the server dynamically renders some HTML in response to requests. All of the ASP.NET technologies are based on that model, whether it's web forms, MVC, Razor pages. That's how they fundamentally work. The UI rendering is happening on the server in a request reply pattern. Blazor is actually completely different from that. Blazor is all about client-side UI. It's much more like Angular or React or Vue, where you want your UI to be in the browser. It's event-driven. It's stateful. Blazor is all about that client-side interactivity. And so the two models actually are complementary. They're not one doesn't subsume the other. It's not like all your apps should now be Blazor apps. They actually can be a mix. And even if you actually look carefully at the server-side Blazor template, it already is a mix because the initial rendering of the app is actually handled by a Razor page. The whole app actually gets pre-rendered initially on the server. All the components get run, and we generate, the initial set of HTML, send that down to the client. Then we set up the SignalR connection and set up interactivity. And you can sprinkle in a little bit of components into your existing MVC or Razor page-based applications. So it's not that Blazor becomes the one true way to do everything going forward. It is a complementary technology now for our existing set of server-side rendering technologies that now enables you to do client-side stuff, but without having to write JavaScript.
So that's a really interesting point you made there. And is that something you're thinking about, maybe making Blazor work a little more seamlessly with existing frameworks like MVC, web forms?
Yeah, in fact, we've already done a good chunk of that work. Like from a page or from a view, you can call a component and say, I would like to put a component here. And then we will wire up that component for interactivity within your existing MVC or Razor page-based application. So that's something you can actually do today.
Awesome. Now, here's a question that well, will make you chuckle, but will it be possible to make progressive web apps in Blazor? So have almost native mobile apps developed on .NET?
Yes, absolutely. So Blazor is a client-side web technology, so you can absolutely build PWAs with it. People have already been playing around with that. In fact, one of the demos that I did at the recent Microsoft Build conference was taking an app that started out as a server-side Blazor app, and then I switched it to be a client-side Blazor app, and then added us. I had to add some. You have to add some JavaScript in order to set up the service worker. We don't have a .NET story for doing that yet. Maybe we will in the future. So you have to add the service worker code and the necessary manifest for a PWA, and then you're all set to go. You can now run that application as a PWA. You can install it, say, like on a Win 10 machine, and run it as if it was a native Windows application. That's something that is absolutely possible. And in the future, I hope that we'll actually have like a Blazor PWA template where we, do all those mechanics for you.
And I say chuckle because we had a whole slide on that, which we ended up removing. But yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, the Blazor model is very flexible. PWA is on the roadmap. We've also experimented with using Blazor with Electron. Electron is a way of doing cross-platform desktop apps using an embedded Chromium shell, and we've have some public samples showing using Blazor to drive an Electron app, so you can write cross-platform desktop apps using .NET and web technologies. That's something hopefully even later down the road we will could support as well.
Nice. Okay, so I can make my own version of Slack using Blazor.
Yeah, or Visual Studio Code or any of the other many Electron-based apps.
Awesome. Now, here's a question. Is Blazor intended to be used in large applications like accounting applications?
Sure. Yeah, big or small. There's no real limit there. The server-side Blazor model in particular I think is really nice because it's if you have an app like it's a line of business application where you have a really good network connection, then server-side Blazor is a great solution for those types of apps. There are features that I think longer term that we want to do to help scale up the size of the app. One feature people often ask us for is what we often call lazy loading of application areas. Like imagine you want to have little islands for your app where you download, the first part of the app and you can run that section. And then if they happen to start using functionality that's part of a different part of the app, then you can lazily load that part of the app. That's not something that we have today, but it's absolutely on our backlog to do.
There's another question here. It says, is it possible to execute any .NET compatible DLL in the browser with Blazor? What about CAD applications, for instance, or any other that involve a lower level integration with browser objects like Canvas?
Great question. So we support .NET Standard 2.0 in Blazor apps today. If you're not familiar with .NET Standard is like it's a spec. It's a standardized set of APIs that all of the different .NETs, like Mono one for Xamarin and .NET Framework, .NET Core, then go and implement. And as a library author, what that enables you to do is target that specified set of APIs, and then your library can then work on all of those runtimes. So we support .NET Standard 2.0 based libraries in Blazor today, with some caveats. Like there are some APIs in .NET Standard 2.0 that fundamentally will just never work in a browser. Like I said, from a Blazor app, you can't just go arbitrarily do things with the file system because you're running in the browser security sandbox. That's just not allowed. So the APIs that try to do functionality that isn't supported in a browser will throw platform not supported exceptions. Other examples would be like opening arbitrary network connections to anywhere you want to. You can't do that from a browser, so the corresponding APIs will, of course, throw. You're not going to be connecting directly to your database on the server from the browser. So you do still have to live within the constraints of the browser. If you're using a library that needs more functionality than what can be done in the browser, then you will hit runtime exceptions currently. We are working on going through all the .NET Standard 2 APIs and flagging the ones that work in the browser and the ones that just can't be made to work, so that we can give you like an analyzer that will look at your code and say like, hold on, like, we support .NET Standard 2.0, but this is not going to do what you expect. If you have libraries that need that have native integration, like do things with the OS, well, you're running in the browser, so you're not going to be running arbitrary C code to touch system APIs from the browser. But people can take those libraries and cross-target them, so that instead of calling, say, a Windows API, they call into the corresponding browser API and give you an experience that would work in WebAssembly. That is a scenario that we do intend to enable.
All right, and somebody had a comment that said, wouldn't it be better to take .blazor as the extension for component files? But I would say don't even entertain that, Dan. That would be a breaking change. But if you do decide to change it, you can go with Danzor. I think that's a good name.
Danzor is the extension. So one of the things I love about Blazor is it is open source. It is public. All the development that we do is public and open source, and we talk to the community a lot about changes that we make. We did settle on the .razor extension for these component files instead of using .blazor, and part of the reason for that is .razor allows the syntax of what's in those files to be independent of the app model. Like if you wanted to use .razor to compile something other than a component, then that leaves that open for us to do in tooling instead of coupling it so tightly to specifically the Blazor programming model. We think of the Razor components as being a little bit more generic than Blazor. So that's why we went with that naming. Yeah, we had a bunch of people that suggested .blazor as the extension. We understand where that feedback's coming from, but we have made a decision to continue on with .razor.
All right, we'll just take a few more questions. There's some. Is Blazor the death of WinForms? I don't think we should consider that at all.
Not the death of anything. It's all the existing .NET technologies, they are fully supported. They have a really long life cycle. Like WinForms is, I don't know if people have heard about the work to bring WinForms support to .NET Core. So WinForms has we wouldn't port WinForms to .NET Core 3.0 in the same release that we're shipping Blazor if Blazor was going to mean the death of WinForms. Like these are complementary technologies that have to have different scenarios. In fact, even some people sometimes ask me about the death of JavaScript, like is WebAssembly and or even Blazor going to be the death of JavaScript? And I would say the answer is no. WebAssembly and Blazor don't restrict what you do with the web. They don't limit your options. It broadens the options. People who want to write JavaScript will continue to write JavaScript, and that experience will continue to get better. What's wonderful about things like Blazor and other WebAssembly-based technologies is now if you want to write in .NET or in Go or in Swift or whatever, like all of those languages and frameworks and tools are now available to you for web development, which I think is great.
Awesome. There's a couple of questions let me address about the DevExpress Blazor. Like Bill is asking, is there a list of UI component offerings that we've committed to add in a particular release? Internally, yes. We haven't been very forthcoming about our list of what we're adding. Well, I shouldn't say that. We have somewhat been, right? So for example, folks have asked us like, hey, when are you going to bring charts? That's definitely on the list, right? We want to bring that. Somebody else asked us, are you eventually going to make everything from your ASP.NET library available for Blazor? I can't.
Some.
You know what? Dan would love for me to say yes. Yeah, we're so committed to Blazor. And here's the thing. We're absolutely committed to Blazor. It all depends on customer adoption, right, Dan? I mean, let's say by 2020, folks are still, saying like we're going to wait until client-side Blazor is more useful than server-side. Or, it all depends on the feedback of what the customers want and what they're willing to, shell out good money for. So we're absolutely listening to what you have to say. So go to that GitHub page. Let us know. I need a XYZ component because I've got this scenario. That really helps us in figuring out what we should bring first. All right. Somebody wants a tree component. Again, let us know on the items. And somebody else says, we are waiting for a more complete DevExpress Blazor package. We're currently starting a new project, et cetera, but then they plan to replace it. Now, I've heard this before where folks are ready to use Blazor now, but they're like, well, it's in preview. It really looks like I should wait, so I'm going to go with something client-side first, and then maybe I'll convert it. Well, again, the conversion obviously is not really a conversion. It's more of a rewrite. Of course, as going into it, as long as you understand that, if you start something with, of course, let's say if you go with .NET Core, then you have less of a conversion or a rewrite, but they are different frameworks, right, Dan?
They are absolutely different frameworks, and yeah, you should definitely account for that. Like it is. I actually regularly get questions and emails from customers saying like, can I take a bet on Blazor right now? I have a project and I was going to go with some JavaScript framework, but I'd much rather go with Blazor. And we understand the timing of those things, and September is the release date, so I would plan around that. If you do try to go earlier with preview bits, like Mehul said, please do be prepared to deal with some amount of churn. Like we are not done. In Preview 7 and Preview 8, there will be changes. There will be bug fixes that we will be doing as we stabilize and get Blazor ready for production. We're working really hard to make sure that by the time we get to the 3.0 stable release date in September, that you have a good experience with Blazor. We want to make sure that when you start trying to build your app, that you're going to be successful. So we are still in preview, and you should account for that. Keep sending us feedback, keep sending us issues. That helps us make Blazor better, helps us prioritize. But you should absolutely take that into account if you're planning to do anything early with Blazor.
Awesome. Maxis had a comment and a question. He says he's coming from old web forms, never really tried a MVC. Now Blazor looks very promising, looks great. And will Blazor support VB?
So Blazor, it's based on a normal .NET runtime. That runtime executes normal .NET ILs, which as long as if you're using a .NET based language that compiles the IL, then you can use that code in a Blazor app. So you can absolutely write VB code and use it in Blazor. The one constraint that we do have is that for component authoring, the .razor files, Razor syntax is fundamentally a C# and HTML based syntax. We don't support VB HTML in .NET Core. That was a decision that's been made, and there's no plans to try and bring that back just because of the costs associated with doing so. So because of that, when the Razor compiler runs, it'll turn your Razor files into C# files. And so those need to live in a CS project. So your Blazor app itself does need to be a C# project, and your Razor files will need to live in a C# based project. But any other logic that you want to write, like business logic, that absolutely can be written in whatever .NET language you want, whether it's VB or F# or whatever. So from that perspective, you do have some level of VB support, but we don't have any plans to enable direct component authoring with Razor in VB, just because the amount of work required to rewrite the Razor compiler to also be able to parse VB, and the tooling is unfortunately just too much for us to take on.
And a couple of last questions. So Alex asked, will this allow us to write disconnected clients that run without being connected to a server? Yes, Alex, that's essentially the client model. But somebody was commenting, where did it go? I would have thought the add functions would have been in a separate file from the get-go rather than mixing with HTML.
Yeah, that's a common feedback that we get. So there is a pattern that you can use if you prefer to have that at functions block just live in a kind of like a code behind file. Today that model is based on inheritance. What you do is you define a class that derives from component base. And then in your Razor file, you just inherit from that class. So any methods or properties that you want to inherit into your actual component generated component class, you can do that by inheritance today. In the future, we'd like that model to be based on partial classes, where you can have the code behind file just be a partial class. That's not supported yet, but we do plan to address that as part of the 3.0 release. So yes, you can do that. The one thing I would say though is that it is somewhat, in some sense, an aesthetic choice, but there's some value in having that code and the markup live all together. Like they are in some sense tied to each other. Like the UI and the logic associated with it, UI really are one class. So I would try it out. Like try out the functions block. You might like it. We find that people that give it a little try, they do tend to appreciate the simplicity. But if it's not your cup of tea, that's totally cool. You can separate that code out into a base class.
Now, you mentioned this earlier about security, but somebody was asking, I was going to ask about auth. How do we protect our code from hacker?
So the code that gets downloaded is just the same as like downloading JavaScript. So any code that if you're writing a client-side Blazor application, the code that you're writing in that client project is going to get downloaded to the user's browser, and it's just going to be there as normal .NET DLLs. They can disassemble them and look at them and do whatever they want with them. So you need to remember that when you're writing client-side Blazor apps. This is no longer a server-side technology when you're shipping the DLLs down to the client. So there's no. Sometimes people, when they ask this question, what they're saying is that I've got some, proprietary IP in my code, and I don't want that to be visible to the user, and that they can just grab and do whatever they want with. If that's the case, server-side Blazor is a great model for you, because then all your code does stay on the server, and the client never sees that code. One example we often have demoed in the past, or demonstrated, is you take ML.NET, which is a machine learning library for .NET, and let's say you train a model based on data that you have, and that model is, that's proprietary information. You don't want to necessarily share it with the world. Well, with server-side Blazor, you can run ML.NET and that machine-trained model on the server, and then just send the updates to the UI over that real-time SignalR connection. Now, another pivot on what you might mean by this is, how do I just do authentication with my app? Like, what's the security model for logging in users and protecting resources and all those types of things? That's what we've been working on for Preview 6, and will ship later this month. You can use all the standard web security patterns. So Cookie-based authentication is perfectly fine with Blazor applications. You can use ASP.NET Core Identity to log in users and register users. If you want to use a like a access token or a security token based pattern like with Identity Server, you can also do that as well with a client-side Blazor application. So all those things are possible.
Awesome. All right. So somebody asked about our roadmap. Again, we don't have one, but well, we haven't published anything yet. Like I said, right now we really want your feedback. So the GitHub page is best for that. And somebody else made a comment about will there be a feature in DevExpress Blazor to take advantage of existing DevStream developed code and projects? And so that question, and I've seen this before, where customers, we have a client-side set of components that are built from JavaScript, and they're fantastic, right? Again, these components that we're building, they're native for Blazor. One of the things I wanted to mention is that they are built from, the rendering is based on Bootstrap. Now, why did we do that? Because Dan and his team has essentially chosen Bootstrap as their model, right? So, for example, what is the page called?
All of our templates are using Bootstrap by default. Bootstrap 3.
Exactly.
Bootstrap 4. Sorry. Yeah, Bootstrap 4.
Exactly. I mean, not just this Blazor stuff, but also most ASP.NET templates. Microsoft made the choice many years ago to go that route because Bootstrap is the most popular front-end library, and it's got a huge ecosystem. And so what we've done is we're taking rendering from some of our Bootstrap controls, but the rendering only, meaning that these are not any controls from any particular framework. They are completely written for Blazor. But what's nice is with this Blazor support, Bootstrap support, you can easily swap out and change it to any other themes and so forth. So as you can see, as I'm changing themes here, it easily adapts to whatever. And this includes any theme.
Cool.
So yeah.
Nice, yeah.
You can take, Dan, if you've got a special theme that you've made with Bootstrap, and I know you've made one, then you can bring that in here.
My hot dog theme, like bright yellow and red, and
absolutely. You know, I know you're a huge fan of those Costco hot dog deals. I mean, they're delicious. All right. So with that, let's finally one last question, which is lazy component loading areas going to be included in the first official release of client-side Blazor?
No, that's not, unfortunately, currently in the roadmap. We plan to ship the first release without lazy loading support. The reason for that is that a lot of the benefit you get out of lazy loading, you have to get your app pretty big before it starts to make a difference in a Blazor app, because particularly for client side, the initial the app tends to be dominated by the initial download of the runtime. So then lazy loading just one little DLL from a different part of your app, which is like 30 kilobytes, like it didn't really save you that much. But longer term, we will support it, but it's not expected for V1. It is something we've heard a lot of people ask for, so it is definitely something though that we do plan to eventually do. V1 is not the end; it's just the beginning.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I can't thank you enough. This has been a pleasure. You're very cordial. We really appreciate you coming on to the webinar and helping answer all these excellent questions.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's absolutely my pleasure. I'm happy to share these, to talk about Blazor at any opportunity, and I invite everyone to join us in the conversation. Like, come take a look at our GitHub repo. All the Blazor development happens in the ASP.NET Core repo, so /ASP.NET/ASP.NET Core on GitHub, and there's also a Blazor Gitter. If you're interested in having a real-time chat with the Blazor community, they're very active there and very nice and helpful. If you're hitting problems with Blazor apps, that's a good place to go. And yeah, I'm excited to be trying out some DevExpress components and seeing what else people build with Blazor.
Absolutely. And again, you can reach us online. So Dan has made himself accessible. Daniel Roth. This Dan Roth 27 on Twitter, which is way better than the first 26 Dan Roths. Right, those guys, they don't know what they're talking about. But
it only took 27 versions.
That's right. That's right. Nailed it with the 27th iteration of the Matrix. All right. So thank you again, Dan, and I'll hand it back to you, Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. All right, everybody. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I already posted the link in the chat box. While you're on our channel, please subscribe and ring the bell so you're notified when we release new content. You will also get a follow-up email with a link to this webinar recording. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Dan Roth. We're so appreciative for his time. Thanks to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.